In case you missed last week's announcement, you can now support Heavy Hands on Patreon.
If you don't know what Patreon is, it's basically ongoing crowdfunding. Essentially, it's a platform that will allow you, our listeners, to patronize our show in exchange for rewards.
Currently, we have rewards set for monthly pledges of $1, $3, $5, and $20.
You can get your name read on the show or posted on the Heavy Hands website, and you can even get a guaranteed spot in the Heavy Bag, our listener mail segment.
If you'd like to donate more than that per month, we're open to discussing other rewards, including custom scouting work and fight analysis.
We've enjoyed bringing you all the finer points of face punching for the last year, and we look forward to doing so for a long time yet.
Please help us cover our production costs and keep the show running smoothly each and every week. Check out Heavy Hands on Patreon.com. I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I'm your host, as always, Connor Rebush, joined, as always, by Patrick Weidman. And we have a fantastic, mind-boggling, crazy weekend of fights coming up in the world of MMA. We have 3 UFC events happening 3 nights in a row, culminating in UFC 194 with the main event of Jose Aldo defending his featherweight title against interim champion Conor McGregor, and then Chris Weidman, middleweight champion, defending against Luke Rockhold, and just all kinds of amazing fights all over all 3 of these cards. And we're going to be talking about some of those this week, saving Aldo McGregor for next week. But before we get into those fights, Pat, shall we gloat about Tyson Fury?
I think we should gloat about Tyson Fury. Because, you were bold enough to pick Tyson Fury. I don't think I went quite that far. I think I said I don't understand why he's being written off, and I think he has a great chance of winning.
Yeah, I felt pretty strongly he had the style to beat Vladimir Klitschko, and lo and behold, he sure did, and pretty convincingly.
Yeah, it was not even that close.
No.
But pretty much all of the things that we talked about in that fight, in terms of Fury using his length, his activity, his combinations, his willingness to bang on the inside, that he was willing to get a point deducted for rabbit punches in order to stay busy in the clinch and not just let Vlad hold. Yeah. That was, I think we kind of had that one. So let's take a moment to appreciate ourselves.
And several people thanked me on Twitter for giving them the confidence to bet on Tyson Fury. So don't always take my words as gospel. I have pretty awful success when it comes to fantasy sports and betting myself, but sometimes you get a big one right. And we had a pretty strong feeling about that one at least being a competitive fight. And it was more than that. So it was fun too. It was a weird fight. It was kind of ugly, but in a fascinating way. I didn't think it was a boring fight.
Yeah, that was one of those things. I did not understand the claims that it was like this awful fight. But that's the thing, man. You got to step out of. We got to staying out of the boxing Twitter sphere. It has been the best decision I've ever made, because it's just a miserable place.
There's a site that I used that had a poll asking who would win the fight, and there were 13 options on this poll. There was Klitschko by KO round 1, all the way through Klitschko KO round 12, and then Klitschko by decision. Fury was so overlooked going into this that the people who are on this site did not even think that Fury even deserved a poll option. He wasn't even an option. And that kind of thing is a little silly. Bit of a, I don't want to say a hive mind and paint people as morons, but a bit of an echo chamber there. We get that in MMA too, but there's a little bit of an echo chamber where one person says this loud enough and long enough, and it just kind of becomes gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. But, not necessarily the world's most scintillating fight, but certainly an interesting one.
Yeah.
And if you were watching live, one with a lot of stakes and a lot of drama attached.
Absolutely. It should be. I think we should stop talking about how boring it is and talk about how an 11-year world heavyweight champion, who's been a lineal champ for a long time now, was dethroned, soundly outboxed by a young, up-and-coming pug. I thought it was a really fascinating upset. But on to the MMA. We have a number of fights we're going to be talking about on today's episode, everybody listening at home. In the final segment, we're going to talk about Paige Van Zandt versus Rose Namajunas. We're going to be talking about Aljamain Sterling versus Johnny Eduardo, and we're going to be talking about Edson Barboza versus Tony Ferguson. Before that, we will be discussing Jacare Souza, Ronaldo Jacare Souza versus Yoel Romero. But first, we're going to talk about the co-main event of UFC 194, and that is Chris Weidman versus Luke Rockhold, a fight that from a purely tactical perspective, from a technical perspective, trying to think of strategies for both of these fighters is almost more fascinating than Aldo McGregor, the main event. And I think that's kind of going to be the running theme of this episode, or at least this segment discussing the fight, is just how damn hard it is to parse anything from this matchup. It's just so closely matched in every single area.
Yeah, and that in that way it contrasts really heavily with Aldo McGregor, because with Aldo McGregor you can and we will do like a 3 keys to victory thing for each guy. It's nowhere near because they match up in really specific and predictable ways. Who will win those battles is kind of up in the air and depends a lot on game planning and strategy and the specific sets of tactical responses for both guys. This fight is much more chaotic and fluid in the way that Rockhold and Weidman match up. There are fewer concrete things that you can point to as, well, if this guy does this, then he'll win the fight. There's a lot more variability and adaptability in terms of what's going to happen over the course of 5 rounds here. Right.
So maybe over the course of this first segment, and we may let it bleed over into the second segment because there's so much to talk about here, we can try to come up with game plans for each of these fighters. And as difficult as it will be to summarize game plans in 3 major points, why don't we try to come up with what we think are the most important areas for each of these 2 guys? The most important tactics to pursue, the most important weaknesses to press, the most important strengths to amplify or enhance. And let's first just talk about the fighters themselves. Luke Rockhold, I think he's probably gotten better since coming to the UFC. In fact, I'm sure he has. It looked like he was maybe not destined for real greatness after that knockout to Vitor Belfort, but how do you think he has changed since then?
Well, I think he's more confident, and I think he's more aggressive. Mm-hmm. Those seem to me to be the major thing, and also much more willing to use his grappling. He's as good as Rockhold is on the feet, and I think that there are some misconceptions about this. I noticed this today. I was tweeting about this fight. I think there are some real misconceptions about Rockhold's game. He is as good a striker as he is. He is a much better grappler than he is a striker, to the extent that in a division with Jacare Souza and formerly Damian Maia, Luke Rockhold might be the best grappler in that division. Yeah, and I think he is one of the very best MMA adapted grapplers in terms of the overall outlines of his skill set on the mat that we have ever seen in this sport.
And it didn't really go to the mat, but he kind of cemented that idea, at least that he's an overall better grappler, by out grappling defensively Jacare Souza back in Strikeforce.
Yeah, Jacare got him down repeatedly and could not get a single thing going on the mat.
And he had to work really hard to get him down too.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what Rockhold does. Like, to have Jacare on top of you on multiple occasions, and to stop Jacare, who has probably the best top game in MMA history, when you put everything together, from getting anything going, is an unbelievable accomplishment. But Rockhold has a particular combination of defensive wrestling skills and mat wrestling skills that play together with an elite jiu-jitsu game. Like, he could have been one of the very best competition grapplers in the world had he not decided to go the MMA route. But instead, he went with the MMA route.
In that regard, he's very similar to Chris Weidman, who has proven to be kind of a prodigy submission grappler himself. He hasn't quite looked like that in MMA, but you almost wonder if both of these guys are going through stages of development and if Rockhold is further along than Weidman. Because for a while there, it was like Rockhold was the wrestler. He learned to grapple. He got his submissions and stuff. But then as he started to learn to strike, he really kind of fell in love with it. He used it a lot. That loss to Vitor Belfort seemed to be the one that really cemented the current well-roundedness in his game, where he went back to aggressively pursuing opponents on the ground and throwing them off balance and just using his excellent positional grappling, setting up traps, all of this stuff. And Chris Weidman started off as a guy who got submissions, outstruck Anderson Silva, and is maybe just now coming around to really pursuing the submission grappling and the wrestling game again himself.
Yeah, I mean, I think both guys, a lot of it has to do with the matchups that they've faced. And I think that Rockhold makes his submission grappling game work without being a takedown artist. He really doesn't get that many takedowns. He doesn't try for that many takedowns. That's not really his thing. What he excels at is exploiting even the slightest opening that you give him. He does not need to get you down to make his submission game work. He really excels at the front headlock. He's a really excellent counter grappler. If you shoot in on him, then he is almost certainly going to end up on top. He's going to find a way to submit you at some point in that. If you stumble, if you trip, and you give your back for even a second, he's going to hop on your back. Whereas Weidman is a much more traditional MMA wrestle grappler, just one of the very best that we've ever seen at it, in terms of using his takedowns to get you down and then working from top position and having the additional benefit of being really excellent in transition as well with his front headlock game. He too has an unreal front headlock.
Yeah. So where do we start? Let's talk about Rockhold as the challenger and try to pick apart the things that he might have an advantage in over Chris Weidman. I think that Rockhold is a little better as a boxer than both of us have given him credit for in the past. Just in terms of pure technique in each strike. He's got a decent straight left. We both talked a lot in the past, and we will continue to today, about his counter right hook. And he's got a great kicking, of course, so a pretty well-rounded striking game. He's also got one of my favorite stances in MMA because he seems to really understand the idea of pulling his head offline and away from the opponent and protecting himself using distance without having to actually retreat, which is also helped by the fact that he's got a really long frame so he can really get his legs into range before his head comes into danger. But the one thing that I think is a real limitation for Rockhold in the feet is his combination punching, or really lack thereof. Because he does not seem to know how to put together even two punches on a regular basis. But when you get into the realm of throwing 3 or 4 punches one after the other, it doesn't seem to get it. He understands how to use his punches to back an opponent up and set up a kick. But once he's in the pocket, he doesn't seem to be able to put an uppercut behind a hook and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that is absolutely a limitation of his game. He's one of the last sharpshooters who's MMA striking at a high level these days. This sport has seen a real shift towards combination striking, and John Jones to an extent is kind of like that. Yeah. But he's kind of in a class of his own in terms of operating at such a long range that combination striking isn't a thing that he really needs to do. Everybody else has gone to combination striking. Luke Rockhold, because of his length, has kind of made it work, but it's still a problem for him. With that said, he's still really, really dangerous in exchanges because of the way that he moves his head, because of his accuracy in placing single shots or maybe 2 shots at a time, and the way that he subtly moves in the pocket. He's got great footwork in the pocket, really finds excellent angles, is a natural at finding the outside angle for himself too.
Yeah, protects himself while he kicks really well too. He's got great awareness just in general, where he's almost always has a hand in position to parry something. He's usually taking his head offline when he kicks. He pulls to create distance, pulling his head back over his rear foot, shifting his weight back when he feels a threat coming towards his head. He's much better defensively than I think I realized. Having looked at him in the past, he's pretty solid in that regard. And Chris Weidman, not so much.
Yeah, Weidman is a pretty limited defensive fighter. So as we were talking about this beforehand, I think the way that we talked about that, Weidman is willing to exchange. He's a pressure. That's one of the things that makes him dangerous as a pressure fighter, is the fact that he's willing to bang. With that said, Rockhold is probably a little more technically sound in those exchanges. Weidman gets by a lot on durability. But in general, defensively, I don't think there's any question that Rockhold is sounder. And a lot of that has to do with his length and the way that he uses his length. Yeah. But he also just moves his head more, and he parries more. He's more active with that. Yeah,
absolutely. And in Rockhold, in Weidman's favor, I would say that the fact that he has a very active jab, even against southpaws, his jab was very effective in the limited portions that he spent on the feet against Vitor Belfort, and it was very effective against Lyoto Machida as well. Even as a setup, he at least throws it. And Anderson Silva, he's actually fought a lot of southpaws, hasn't he? So he seems to know how to keep his jab an active part of his game, and that's great because it's good, it's stiff, it's powerful. He's got a really heavy right hand to put behind it. He's probably the harder hitter between the two of these men. In fact, I have no problem saying that he is. So he's got that advantage there in the striking, where if he can come forward and he is willing to throw when the other guy's throwing, he's probably not going to be too worried about Rockhold's counters, and he will throw several punches in a row, which will probably test Rockhold's head movement. But then when Rockhold starts to throw back, if he does sting Weidman, and Weidman has been kind of vulnerable to that right hook himself, he's going to have to back off if he wants to defend himself. I think that's a real limitation. He's kind of like that Matt Brown archetypal pressure fighter that we've talked about so much on previous episodes, where he's so geared towards coming forward and pushing the opponent around and keeping a pace that he doesn't really know how to react when he's not able to, or when he's forced to reset. It's a total reset. He's not going to take a half step back and counter or move his head and keep the same distance.
Yeah. That's something that really stood out to me watching film here, is how uncomfortable Weidman is really doing anything other than moving forward. And conversely, we talk about Weidman as a pressure fighter, and he is. He's a very defined pressure fighter. Rockhold also does his best work moving forward. We talk a lot about his counter right hook. We talk a lot about his kicks, but really he does his best work backing you up towards the fence himself. Yeah. That's really his wheelhouse. The fact that he does other things a lot of the time, and the fact that specific stylistic matchups that he's had with opponents, especially Jacare, have forced him to do other things, because Jacare is so unbelievably aggressive. I think it's led to the impression that Rockhold is more of an outfighter, when really, I think, given his druthers, he would like to pressure.
Yeah, it does seem like that. That's his general inclination. He was very happy to come forward against both Machida and Bisping, and he looked really good doing it, especially at that second round and towards the end of the first round against Bisping. He really got into a rhythm coming forward on the feet and looked fantastic doing it. The problem for Rockhold as a pressure fighter is he doesn't really have a jab. He doesn't have combination punching. I think Weidman's probably the better feinter. So I don't know that, to me, it's like Rockhold likes to pressure, but he doesn't necessarily have the breadth of tools to effectively do it all the time.
Yeah, that's true. I think, if we were going to peg Rockhold into a category, I guess you would probably say he's a boxer puncher.
I think so, yeah, where he's happy to come forward, but he really doesn't, it's really just about being comfortable anywhere, which he does seem to be. But his problem is that he kind of relies on an opponent respecting him. Just as we said, I don't know who we were talking about recently, where we said they grapple like the opponent is obligated to grapple with them. But he kind of pressures like the opponent is going to step back, rather than making them do so. And with Weidman, with his jab and his power and his feints and his footwork, and that's the other thing, Rockhold tends to attack in straight lines. His advantage is that he's got long arms and long legs, and he throws good kicks, so he has circular attacks to catch you pivoting out. But he definitely tends to come straight forward when he attacks, shifting forward with punches and kicks, and Weidman does not have that problem. So can we maybe, let's try and parse this. Let's say if we can come up with one key for each of these guys in the striking exchanges, what we think is the most important thing they can do to control the pace, the distance, the movement of the striking.
Well, I think for Weidman, he has to pull his head off the center line with every shot that he throws. That's the big one to me. It's a given that he's going to be there to be hit. He needs to make himself he needs to cut down on the number of times that Rockhold can connect with him. That was one thing that really stood out to me watching Weidman against Lyoto Machida, was how hittable Weidman was mid-shot, how hittable he was with same-time counters. Yeah. That practically every time Weidman kicked, which he had to do in order to pin Machida against the fence, he had to cut off that lateral movement, how hittable he was as he threw those kicks. If he does that against Luke Rockhold, who has a much longer reach and is a much harder hitter shot for shot, then he's going to get himself knocked out.
Though Rockhold isn't the interceptive puncher that Machida is. He doesn't typically tend to lunge forward and attack. Though I do remember actually a couple counter straight lefts he hit while the opponent was trying to kick him.
He is very willing to do that. He will pick his spot much more so than I thought going in. Going into this fight is how good Rockhold is when given the opportunity to sit down on his straight left and throw it as a counter.
As soon as I started to say that, I remembered him countering a Bisping high kick with a straight left, and
Exactly.
almost knocking Bisping down. So he can do it. He definitely can. Not as much of a hair trigger as Machida with that straight left, but he can definitely do it.
And you have to know, given who Rockhold's coaches are, that they will have picked that out.
No doubt. Yeah.
They're going to know that. So that's one for me for Weidman. What would you say is one here, Connor?
I think for Weidman, it's really key to feint and jab. I think that is absolutely instrumental here. I don't think many of Rockhold's opponents have done it, although I recall Michael Bisping having his best success when he jabbed with Rockhold. Just stepping inside his foot and sticking him with the left hand, because he's always worried about the right leg and the right kick. He's a southpaw. That's what the vast majority of his opponents do to him. So I think Weidman has to use his jab, and I think he has to really trust in that jab and that left hook coming forward. And I think he has to feint too. I think he has a much better chance of getting Rockhold to accept moving backward, which obviously favors Weidman. I think he has a much better chance of making that happen if he can suggest takedowns, if he can feint different strikes, if he can make Rockhold worry about what to counter and when.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because Rockhold has a habit, and I think that he this is just kind of my read of this. Rockhold has a tendency to move backwards in straight lines.
Yeah.
Right? That he'll take a couple of steps backward in straight lines. I think he thinks he's doing it on purpose in order to draw guys into his right hook. I think in this particular and he is a lot. I think a lot of the time, because he's so long, he's baiting guys into coming forward and walking them onto that right hook. I think that in this particular matchup, that could be a real disadvantage for him, and something that Weidman and his coaches, who are very intelligent, I'm sure have picked up on and will be ready for. They will have things planned for when Rockhold does that.
Yeah, it's like Rockhold does it to set up, but he's also, against most opponents, he's able to get away with it where there are openings there. And I think Weidman probably has one of the longest reaches of any of Rockhold's opponents.
Mm-hmm. That's the big thing about about Weidman, is how deceptively long and deceptively fast he is. That he's on you. That's what makes him so dangerous as a pressure fighter, is how dangerous he is. He's on you before you know it.
Yeah, according to Wikipedia, Weidman has an inch reach advantage. Mm-hmm. He's got long arms, and he knows how to use them. I think that was a big factor when he fought Anderson Silva as well. Being able to cover that distance more quickly than expected, and having the footwork to do so without letting go of the control of the center of the octagon. So I think that's really important for him. Maybe we can identify one for each of the phases. Let's talk about the clinch and the wrestling then. If we're talking about the wrestling, obviously Chris Weidman wants to take Rockhold down, maybe, because it's going to be a nest of snakes once he gets him there, and Luke Rockhold will want to prevent being taken down and look for little opportunistic ways to get to top or the back himself. So who do you think has an innate advantage there? Although I guess we've already agreed no man does, but what are the small, subtle advantages that each of them have? Well,
so I think that if Weidman can get Rockhold's back to the fence, then he's going to have more success wrestling with him. I think that what stands out to me is you do not want to wrestle with Rockhold in open space next to in the middle of the mat, which I think that it creates problems for Weidman, because Weidman, I think, does his best work takedown wise out in the middle of the cage. I think he does not actually do his best work cage wrestling.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that. He's got good reactive shots. He finishes takedowns really well angularly. He takes angles very well to finish double legs, and he gets very deep penetration despite not looking like that quick of a takedown artist. I think he's very good at setting up his takedowns and hiding them behind his strikes. A
lot of that has to do with his length, right?
Sure.
That he's got such long arms that his favored takedown is a snatch single, and once he has the single leg, from there, he'll transition to something else. But so a snatch single favors somebody who's deceptively quick and has really long arms, because you just reach down and grab it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be hard for him, just in terms of the pure wrestling matchup, to get those takedowns against Rockhold, because Rockhold is so good at defending in open space. But I don't know. Like you got to think that Weidman is going to shoot for them, if only to make Rockhold respect the level change.
And I think that's really important. I think that's probably more important than actually getting them, because I'm not totally confident that Weidman really wants to exchange on the ground with Rockhold. I'm not sure he wants to roll around with Rockhold, and while Weidman is a fantastic grappler, his positional grappling is superb. He's got a very kind of old school style of submission grappling with his steady progression of positions on the ground, and that's mixed with a strong front headlock game because of his wrestling background and everything, and some tricky things like leg locks and things like that. But Rockhold is the more aggressive grappler. And he's very, very sneaky with the way that he sets up his submissions and his back takes. You know, he will absolutely walk you into a trap and then jump right on it, and he is a venomous finisher. I'd say he's a better finisher on the ground than Weidman, so I think really establishing the threat is kind of my key for Weidman in the wrestling, and maybe getting Rockhold to the clinch when he can. That it's more important that if he does get him against the fence, instead of working for a takedown and putting your neck out there and everything, that he should maybe just get some head position and work away with knees and short shots, and because he's stronger and more powerful, I think, than Rockhold. So I think if Weidman can pin him in that position, he will be able to eat up some time and build up a little bit of a lead.
See, I'm not necessarily sure that I agree with that. I think that they're like, as good as both guys are at everything else, I think that they're both at their best in the clinch. I think that, especially Rockhold, like I think
really?
that the clinch might actually be Rockhold's best skill set in terms of his striking and his control. He's just so effortlessly strong in that position. Like nobody, not a single fighter that he's fought has had any success at all in a sustained fashion against Rockhold in the clinch. And he's fought some really, really good clinch fighters, guys like Jacare.
It's true.
Nobody has had any success against him there. Whereas with Weidman too, Weidman has beaten everybody that he's fought in the clinch, even Anderson Silva.
Yeah.
So, like that to me is the great unknown of this matchup. That's the great question mark that we're not going to know until they're actually in there. Like we can kind of predict with this other stuff. Like we can see the outlines of the matchup on the ground. If Weidman is in top position, he's probably winning those exchanges. If they're scrambling, Rockhold is probably winning those exchanges. If Rockhold is on top, he's absolutely winning those exchanges. But and we can kind of see what it's going to look like on the feet, but we have no idea who's the better clinch fighter. Like that's really, really hard to tell here.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Okay, why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, we'll give our final thoughts on this matchup before jumping into Jacare versus Romero. But we have to give our final predictions and basically run through the way we see this fight playing out. So all of that after this. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us, and like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. Okay, and we're back. We have to wrap up our Rockhold-Weidman discussion. Weidman-Rockhold. Got to give the champion his respects. We have to wrap that up. So our final predictions, I guess I'll go ahead and jump in first. I think really what stands out is the big deciding factor in this fight, and again, we've already said many times how hard it is to come up with one key, but to me, the one thing that all of my internal arguments keep coming back to, Pat, is Rockhold's stamina. I think that is a really, really big factor here, because I think we've seen from Chris Weidman, I guess I want to say consistently, but he's only had the 2 5-round fights. The Machida fight, and has he ever gone 5 rounds after that?
No, I think
No.
that was the only one.
And he had the fight against Damian Maia. But typically, I think we've seen from Weidman that he tends to have a drop off after the second or third round. It seemed pretty dramatic in the Machida fight, and while body kicks I think played a part in that. Well, first of all, Rockhold's going to be happy to kick the body as well. He's very good at it, and Rockhold, I think, is just kind of a workhorse. We haven't seen Rockhold in a 5-round fight since he went 5 rounds with Jacare, but even way back then, he didn't really seem to have any trouble slowing down. And I can't ever imagine Chris Weidman doing that, just going 5 rounds and looking tireless the entire time. And so if Chris Weidman is maybe a faster starter and slowly fades, and Luke Rockhold takes a little bit to get his rhythm, but gets stronger and then at the very least plateaus, if not getting stronger as the fight goes on, I kind of have to favor Luke Rockhold as just being this really well-rounded, dynamic, non-stop fighter. It's hard to pick against him, even though I know that Chris Weidman can spark him into unconsciousness the way that Vitor Belfort did. I don't know. I think I have to favor him. What do you say, Pat?
Yeah, I mean, as weird as it sounds, I too am going with Rockhold. And, you know, it's always strange picking against a dominant champion.
Yeah.
Like Chris Weidman. You know, that even though, I mean, he won the Machida fight, he lost the last 2 rounds, but they were close rounds, and it took Machida fighting in a way that he has never fought in his entire career to make that happen.
And absorbing a lot of damage along the way.
Yeah, I mean, so that's. And to the extent that that was probably the turning point and what finally sent Machida onto the wrong side of the aging curve were the 2 rounds that he won against Chris Weidman.
Sure, yeah.
So, you know, it's weird picking against a dominant champion in that sense, but I think I too am going to pick Rockhold. I think that cardio is a big factor, and Rockhold's ability to fight strong into the last couple of rounds has a lot to do with that. But for me, it's more that he has more ways to win the fight, that he's more diverse, that he has more things that he can do. I think that his counterpunching is going to give Weidman fits as he comes in. I think that his own ability to pressure, we shouldn't undercut that, and the fact that he's comfortable doing that and Weidman is really not comfortable moving backwards at all. Rockhold is much more comfortable moving backward than Weidman is. I think that's a big part of it too. That how is Weidman going to react when Rockhold stands his ground and comes back after him? Is he going to if he shells up the way that he did against dad bod Vitor Belfort? That's probably not going to go real well for Weidman.
No.
And then on the mat, I think it's going to be real hard for Weidman to use the best part of his game, that top game, that unbelievably vicious top game. I think the Rockhold is going to be able to at the least neutralize it, if not find ways to make his own skill set work there.
Right. That's something we didn't mention either. Both these guys are pretty vicious ground and pound artists. Mm-hmm. Both of them are pretty venomous in every way on the ground.
I mean, I really think that that they're in the top 5 for MMA adapted grappling in terms of the way that they put together their passes with their submissions and use ground strikes to open up both of those things.
Yeah.
This is what MMA grappling is supposed to look like everywhere. In the way that they both integrate wrestling with more traditional jiu-jitsu as well. I mean, it's absolutely seamless.
I almost fear that they will neutralize one another's grappling and that we'll see a striking battle. As much as I love seeing striking battles, I agree. I think these are probably 2 of the very best grapplers the middleweight division has ever seen, if not the best. And so, and with Jacare Souza's out there too, we're going to be talking about him in a minute, but integrated into the whole game, these guys are probably at the top. And so I would love to see them scrambling with each other and just see what happens. But I kind of worry that it won't.
Yeah. Well, it'll certainly be interesting to watch. So I guess I too am picking Rockhold by narrow decision.
Yeah, that seems about right.
I think that's my pick here.
That seems about right. Yeah, because boy, can Weidman take a beating.
Yeah, I mean, God, this is going to be, but this is so good. As meaningful as McGregor-Aldo is going to be, as big a fight as that is, I think this is actually the better matchup of the 2 title fights on the UFC 194 card.
Bold words there, Wyman. Bold words.
Well, hey, I'm nothing if not bold.
I don't know. One of us picked Tyson Fury last week, Pat. One of us picked Tyson Fury.
Yeah, and therein lies the joke.
And neither of us is as bold as Tyson Fury, who is happy to not only put his body at risk in the boxing ring, but to sing off key a much hated Aerosmith '90s vomit from the Armageddon soundtrack. Did you see that after the Klitschko fight?
I did. What a gift, this man.
Yes,
what a gift. Singing
to his improbably named wife, Paris Fury. Everyone in that whole clan is just improbably named.
Well, that's the thing about travelers, man. That's one of many things about travelers, but we don't need to go into that.
Tyson Fury, was named after Mike Tyson because it's a bare knuckle boxing and a boxing society, the Irish Traveler community.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so now that Tyson Fury holds every meaningful heavyweight boxing championship, does this mean that he gets to be the king of the gypsies?
Ooh. His Twitter handle is already Gypsy King, so I'm going to say he's been claiming that throne for some time.
Because that's an actual title, right? Is king of the travelers or king of the gypsies goes to the bare knuckle boxing champion. So does Tyson Fury get to have that title too?
I don't know, but I would love to see some 45-year-old beer-bellied Irish traveler from another family try to box with Tyson Fury. Like a bare knuckle match in an alley somewhere or along some train tracks.
So on that note, have you seen Knuckle?
I think I've seen parts of it. I don't think I've seen all of it though.
Yeah. Okay. To all of our listeners, if there's a great documentary about the King of the Travelers, and that focuses on bare knuckle boxing in that community. It's available on Netflix, I'm pretty sure, called Knuckle. And if you haven't seen it, you have to. It's amazing. I
think I have seen it, actually. I think I did watch it on Netflix probably last year. I don't remember a lot about it. But the thing I was going to say, Tyson Fury, named after Mike Tyson, his cousin Huey Fury is also a very good heavyweight fighter, up and coming. I thought his name seemed shockingly normal, so I went and checked out BoxRec. Do you know what his full name is? Huey Lewis Fury.
Oh my God! It's that's the best thing.
So at any time, I expect him to drop out of the boxing game and become a pop rock singer.
At some point, Connor, I will tell you off air about my experiences with the traveler community when I lived in Ireland.
Oh, I would love to hear it. I'd love to hear it. But at the risk of offending anybody, why don't we keep it off air for now?
That will very much stay off. But so we've got another fantastic middleweight fight on the UFC 194 card to talk about here with Jacare Souza versus Yoel Romero, the Vicar of Violence, Deacon of Destruction, Bishop of Beatdowns, my man.
Yeah, I had a couple of others a while back, and I can't remember any of them right now.
Oh God,
they're the Pontiff of Pain. How's that?
Yeah, Pontiff. I think Pontiff of Pain was a good one.
The Preacher of Pain. I can't use it again. Either way, this is a hell of a matchup, and I'll tell you why.
Of Punishment.
That's a good one. There we go. I'll tell you why I think this fight is particularly interesting. I think these are two extremely similar fighters. Mm-hmm. I think we have two just phenomenally athletic, huge, powerful, explosive. They're knockout artists. They can throw people around the ring or the cage. And both of them also from grappling backgrounds, both of them standout grapplers. Yoel Romero with the Olympic wrestling, and Jacare Souza, I'm not sure what his grappling accolades are. He's like a two-time
world
80
jiu-jitsu champion. I believe he won a no-gi title in there as well.
Right.
Romero won a silver at the 2000 Olympics in freestyle wrestling, and also won the Worlds, which is just as big an accomplishment as winning a gold medal at the Olympics. He won the Worlds.
Right. So we have two phenomenal grapplers, both of them incredibly skilled in that regard, but just also so successful in those fields because of their extreme athleticism. Both of them developed into very well-rounded and top-level mixed martial artists. And it's a really fascinating matchup because of that. It comes down, almost just like Rockhold Weidman, it comes down to some small things, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah. And when you say that they're similar fighters, I mean, their athleticism, their grappling backgrounds, but also they're both essentially burst fighters. Would you say that's safe to say?
Flashes of violence.
Yeah, that both will go substantial periods of time where not all that much is happening, and then all of a sudden they're throwing a crazy combination, duck into the clinch, big takedown, then Romero would follow with a few punches and get back up, and Jacare would start working his top game, which I think is probably the best in MMA.
Yeah, it's his guard passing, his squeeze. Do you recall that he almost finished Francis Carmon with a one-armed rear naked choke?
I do recall that which is freakish and unbelievable.
There aren't many, like Marcelo Garcia is the only man on earth to regularly do stuff like that. So it just shows you the depth of his grappling. Also the fact that he put Chris Camozzi out in about a second after locking on an arm triangle choke, I think, in their first fight.
It was an arm triangle in their first. He armbarred him in the second one.
Yeah, he slices through guards. He keeps incredibly heavy on top. Watching somebody try to play butterfly guards, a butterfly guard against Jacare is almost hilarious. The way that he just squashes the butterfly hooks with ease and slides right over the person's legs, often right into mount. He's just a killer from top position. And a great wrestler as well, but then we have Yoel Romero, who is a stupendous wrestler. Like Jacare, really relies on big, explosive movements. He's well known for, while he was coming up to the UFC, just taking opponents off their feet with ankle picks, something nobody does. You're not allowed to do that in MMA. You can't just reach down and pick someone's foot off the canvas and have them fall on their ass, but Yoel Romero does that kind of thing. So it's you have to imagine that a lot of this fight will play out on the feet unless Yoel Romero wants it on the ground. Would you?
Yeah, I think that, early in his MMA career, Romero caught some flack for not doing a great job of defending takedowns. And there were two things that went into that, I think, is that first, he was still figuring out spacing. That a lot of the time when he threw strikes, he ended up at such a range that he gave his opponents his hips, or he gave them double underhooks, or he gave them an easy path to the takedown. The other part of that, which has since come out in interviews with his training partners, if not with Romero himself, is that he literally did not train wrestling from like 2011 to 2013.
He just wasn't doing it anymore.
He just didn't wrestle at all in his training camps. He didn't spend a minute on it.
That's insane.
Well, yeah, and so in the lead up to we saw him start to use his wrestling again in the Brad Tavares fight. When Tavares shot some good takedowns on him, really had some nice entries, some nice setups, got in deep on his hips. Same deal when he fought Tim Kennedy as well. Kennedy was in on his hips on multiple occasions and just could not get him down and keep him down.
Yeah.
So it's not a coincidence that the moment Romero started wrestling again in his camps, he's been impossible to take down and has started to hit some incredible, unbelievable takedowns on his opponents.
He's kind of like Henry Cejudo with about 10% of the volume, where he's not even necessarily always concerned with getting the takedowns either. It's almost like he sometimes enjoys just feinting takedowns just to watch his opponents react. So much of Romero's game is based around that and based around setting rhythm in the way that much more experienced strikers do. He seems to have kind of an innate understanding of timing and rhythm, which is an underrated piece of athleticism. Normally, when we talk about athleticism, we're talking about things that we can kind of measure and see. So explosiveness, power, speed, things like that, strength. Those are things that we can see and kind of quantify. What we don't talk about is the elite athlete's sense of timing and sense of space. And coordination.
And Romero has both of those in spades.
I would say coordination too, right? Like we don't often talk about things like proprioception, things like that. Just an understanding of distance, an understanding of where the different parts of your body are at any given time. Yoel Romero can do things crazy unorthodox as a striker and still manage to keep his feet. When he throws what was it at the end of one of the rounds against Lyoto Machida? He did something that had him basically stumbling around and still almost finishing a takedown, despite the fact that he did not have his feet under him.
I'm not sure. Let me pull this up here, and as we continue to discuss, I'll take a look at that.
Sure. And as a boxer, Yoel Romero has come along fairly well, but he's kind of like Jacare in that he really relies on these big explosive moments. For a guy from Cuba with a brother who boxes and I imagine has some passing familiarity with the Cuban style boxing, he doesn't really fight like a Cuban boxer. He does not fight behind his shoulder. He doesn't hang back much. He often likes to come forward, though he doesn't do so behind volume, kind of like Rockhold, where he will just kind of press and use feints and things like that to threaten. His brother is Johan Pablo Hernandez, who's actually a very good professional boxer.
Yeah, so that sense of timing and rhythm to me is what really stands out about Romero as a striker. So there's a lot of times where he's not throwing that many strikes, but he's still very active as he's moving through the space of the cage. So the feints are a really big piece of that. The level changes too, and that's where his wrestling and his striking really play together nicely. Especially since that Tavares fight, is he forces opponents to respect the threat of his takedowns and the threat of his level changes. So that's why he does things like punching the thigh, which is bizarre, right? Like, why would you punch somebody's thigh? Well, because there's no difference in the motion that leads you to punching somebody's thigh versus looking for an ankle pick or grabbing the leg to chain into a really explosive double or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And man, the Machida fight, I think, was all about the improvements in Romero's footwork combined with his constant understanding of feinting, which is something that he was very good at as a wrestler as well.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he is a special breed of athlete. And that's one of two factors that lead me, like I'll lead with this, I guess, that lead me to pick him over Jacare here. Even though he's a slight underdog, and I can understand why Jacare is a much more accomplished mixed martial artist, who's a much more experienced mixed martial artist. But historically, Jacare has kind of struggled against guys who can match him in the athleticism department. He had a lot of trouble with Luke Rockhold. He had a lot of trouble against Francis Carmel when that fight was not on the mat.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yeah.
And I think that so when we're talking about bursts of offense, Jacare kind of moves forward in a measured fashion. He's a pressure fighter. His whole goal is to get your back to the fence. His whole game is predicated on that. And so he kind of slowly but surely moves you backwards. And then his athleticism really comes into play in the last little burst there, that he explodes forward into a couple of punches and dives forward into the clinch. What happens when the guy that he's fighting can match him athletically is that his opponent is not there against the fence for that last little burst. So the last 30 or 40 seconds of stalking and measured offense that have led him to that point are just not there for him anymore.
Yeah, and we've seen him also, as you pointed out before we began recording, between segments, when he struggles in the clinch, even when he does manage to get into that range, he'll throw the big right, the big overhand right. Sometimes he'll attack with a hook to the body or right straight to the body. He'll fall into that clinch. And when an opponent can negate him, as Luke Rockhold often did, or when an opponent can quickly separate, as Francis Carmon did during the second round of that fight, which he pretty clearly won, then Jacare is kind of left without recourse. I think that's when his lack of activity really bites him. Whereas a guy like Yoel Romero, and I think I'm picking Romero too, even though I came into this show fully expecting to pick Jacare, you basically talked me out of it by pointing out the fact that Yoel Romero, he doesn't throw a lot of volume either. But I think just the flexibility of his style and his ability to defend takedowns and also his ability to hit takedowns better than maybe anybody else in the division allows him to get away with that. Whereas for Jacare, it's a lot of stalking. It's a lot of patience. It's a lot of small feints, small steps. One big shot, he gets in. And if he doesn't get his takedown, then effectively nothing happened. Or if he was getting hit on the way in, he may have just lost that last minute that he spent trying to set that takedown up. So, and then, we've got the bursts of offense. I think Yoel is probably not well-rounded, but just more diverse. He can do a lot of things. Crazy flying knees, giant high-amplitude takedowns and throws, which I don't doubt he'll be able to hit on Jacare as well as he has anybody else. So what does that leave Jacare with? If he can't get this fight to the ground where he can work his top game, and if he can't land his punch to set up a clinch, then he's going to be forced to actually strike with Romero. And I think Romero's more comfortable just playing a striking match.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think another factor here to bear in mind is that it's going to be the big cage, and that too creates a problem for pressure fighters.
Yes.
That when Jacare had his success against Gegard and Mousasi, it was in pushing him up against the fence, but that was the small cage, and that's a meaningful factor. I mean, that means there's more room for Romero to move on the outside, and Romero does not really have a huge preference in terms of directionality of movement. He's kind of comfortable to do a lot of different things.
I would call him definitely a boxer puncher. He'll do whatever you want him to do as long as it gives him an opportunity to have fun and throw big strikes and hit big takedowns.
Yeah, it's not really a matter of concern to him. I think he's at his best moving forward, but that's not really. But that doesn't seem to cross his mind as like, I need to be doing this in order to win the fight.
And even then, I think he'll probably be able to do that against Jacare. Because it only comes in big bursts, and they're such violent, crazy, explosive attacks combined with level changes and feints and a variety of weapons being thrown at you, that I think that Jacare, still a fairly inexperienced striker, will probably back up in a straight line. You know, Jacare has never been comfortable just accepting a striking match, unless somebody is completely inferior to him athletically, and we all know that's not Yoel Romero.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another factor that comes into this fight is coaching. Romero is a product of American Top Team. He's going to have Ricardo Laborio in his corner. He's got the benefit of all of those training partners and all of those minds working on his behalf. And it's not like Jacare is a poorly trained fighter, nothing to that extent. But it's not American Top Team. Those are not the kinds of people that he has working for him. And if you can put together the right game plan to beat Lyoto Machida, you can put together the right game plan to beat Jacare Souza as well.
Do you think we've already identified is Yoel Romero an underdog in this fight?
He is, yeah. We have picked two underdogs,
We've
Connor.
picked two underdogs in two of the biggest fights of the weekend, so we may be playing a dangerous game here, but that's the way we roll on Heavy Hands. Both of us picking Romero. I think it should be a fascinating fight, though not necessarily an action-packed one.
Yeah, well, there are gonna be long stretches where not all that much happens, and then all of a sudden, Jacare is going to explode forward into 4 punches, dive into the clinch, and try to hit an inside trip. Romero's gonna throw a jumping front kick end up in a double collar tie, throw a jumping knee, and then ankle pick Jacare and punch him twice in the face before he backs off, all in the space of like 8 seconds.
Yeah.
And that's an actual sequence that happened in the Brad Tavares fight. By the way, I didn't make that up.
That's just the kind of things that he does. It'll be a highlight fight, where the fight itself will be a lot of small adjustments, a lot of waiting, a lot of patience, crazy highlights for 10 seconds at a time.
Very much the opposite of a fight like Jose Aldo versus Conor McGregor that's going to be constantly things actually happening.
Yeah, absolutely. We may have a couple fights like that to discuss next. When we come back from our next break, we're going to talk about Paige Van Zandt versus Rose Namajunas, Aljamain Sterling versus Johnny Eduardo, and Edson Barboza versus Tony Ferguson after this. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we are back. First up, Pat, let's talk about Edson Barboza versus Tony Ferguson. You just said before we began recording that Tony Ferguson is perhaps the most overlooked fighter in MMA right now, the darkest of horses, you might say. I'm going to add to that with another superlative and say that he's probably the funkiest fighter in the UFC.
Yeah, literally speaking. His wrestling game, he has a lot of funk in the technical sense.
Bizarre rolls, weird sacrifices and giving up position, but always with purpose, where he has a very innate sense of where a leg is to grab or where he can get a sweep. I mean, even to the fact that when most fighters say rolling with a punch, they mean turning their head. Tony Ferguson literally rolled on the ground after taking a punch from Josh Thompson and looked for a leg lock off of a right hand to the jaw.
Yeah, I mean, like he literally, and in that fight against Josh Thompson, he literally hit a funk roll. Like, so a funk roll, like technically speaking, funk in wrestling is a series of shot counters. So, but it's based around the principle of instead of meeting pressure with pressure the way that you do when you sprawl, you go with your opponent's pressure. You let their pressure take you into a specific roll. And that's what he did when Thompson shot a single on him. He literally hit a funk roll counter to that. Yeah. So he didn't end up on top the way that you would normally try to with a funk roll, but the principle was the same. That was funk.
And it applies to his jiu-jitsu as well. It's kind of the soft art of wrestling, right? Yep. Where you might look for crafty ways that under strict wrestling rules or strict rules of learning wrestling might be considered poor ideas. Like wrestling tends to do a lot of meeting strength with strength. And with good reason. Like there are rules against retreating and things like that in wrestling. So you have to learn to be a good come forward wrestler, which is why when I was discussing Alexander Gustafsson's wrestling with Coach Mike Reardon not long ago, he said that Gustafsson's wrestling works so well because even wrestlers are not that good at using distance and taking backward steps and timing opponents coming in. It's not something that you just don't learn that very much in wrestling. And Tony Ferguson does a great job of using things like that, creating space rather than taking it away, and letting the opponent's momentum work against them rather than trying to fight it, which is perfect for his frame because he's not a very heavily built, powerful guy. He's long and lanky and just weird. Funk is in everything he does. His submission grappling is very similar, and it's never aimless. You know, where he will keep his legs wrapped around an opponent even if he's technically probably in side control, but then just use that as an opportunity to wrap up a leg with his arm and get himself back into full guard. Something like that.
Yeah, it's a really kind of a bizarre but very creative game. You can see the purpose behind what he does. And he's a really interesting kind of striker, especially over the last couple of years as he's developed and he's started to work with different coaches. He was a crisp and technical but fairly standard kind of boxer up until a couple of years ago. And since then, he's added a lot of kicks. He's added a lot of weird stance switching and things like that. Yeah. And he has upped his output. He's drastically upped his output. That's the other piece of it, is he works very, very, very fast. He routinely throws 15 or 20 strikes a minute, which is a ridiculous pace to keep in MMA. And he can still go back to that boxing when he wants to. When he wants to sit down on a 4-punch combination, work behind a piercing jab, he can do that. But he also sets a much longer distance with the snapping front kicks that he throws, a lot of round kicks. He's a dedicated attacker of the body. He's attritive, but he can still finish the fight at any point with a single shot. And
that is the difference, I think, between Ferguson and other fighters like him who use this kind of frenetic stance switching back and forth style, because he really reminds me of former UFC flyweight Tim Elliott. In a lot of ways. Tim Elliott's a very funky striker as well. Weird, awkward stance switches, bizarre movement, very unpredictable. But Elliott never seemed to know how or when to sit down on a strike. And Ferguson absolutely does. When he dropped Gleison Tebow, he just knew, okay, it's time to sit down on a 1-2 and make him respect this because he's still trying to come forward. When he was fighting Josh Thompson, he knew, okay, here's an opening. He's hand fighting. I haven't been able to get to him. He's not too worried about the body. I'm going to crack him with a big elbow over the top. Or I'm going to smash him with a front kick under the rib cage. He's always got these options where he knows when to just drive his weight into a fight-ending shot, a potentially fight-ending shot, and that makes him really dangerous. And then defensively, I think he's one of the more underrated guys on the roster.
Oh, he's exceptional defensively. It's very, very difficult to catch him with a clean shot. Yeah. And this is despite a lot of the time being there to be hit. A lot of the time he's operating in the pocket, but he's an exceptional pocket fighter. Moves his head really well, uses his hands really well to defend, a layered defense. Like, you could see this was Kenny Florian going on and on and on in his last fight with Josh Thompson about Ferguson letting his chin get too high. And there were times, sure, where Ferguson's chin was a little high, but what Florian wasn't picking up on was the fact that to get to his chin, which rarely happened, Thompson was having to get past parries, a tight guard, and layers of head movement as well. And unpredictable, consistent head movement, not just when Thompson was throwing at it.
Yeah, and awkward lateral movement with his feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he's a very defensively sound fighter. There's just a lot to like about him. He can finish you he can finish you anywhere. He can finish you on the feet. He can finish you on the mat. He's a devastating counter wrestler. He's excellent in transitions and scrambles. Like, there's nothing not to like about his game.
Little too content to fight off the bottom.
Yeah, I think that there's that, but
he's got the perfect style for that type of fight because he's incredibly aggressive and very smart with setting up his, he chains submissions and he throws them up constantly. And if he doesn't tap you, he will use them to sweep and get on top. So he at least has that going for him where he throws as much volume off of his back in terms of submissions as he does on the feet.
Yeah, there is rarely a phase where Ferguson looks like he's losing the fight.
Sure.
I would say.
Sure.
And that matters. Even if you're on your back, I think MMA judges have shown in the last few years, if you keep busy there, if it looks like you're doing stuff, even if it's not terribly effective stuff, you're at least not losing it there.
Yeah, he tends to keep his opponents so busy defending that they don't have time to hit him. Yeah. So it's not really the disadvantage to being on his back that it would be for most fighters.
Yeah, and so Edson Barboza. What do you think about Edson Barboza, Connor?
Edson Barboza looked absolutely phenomenal in his last fight. And he's been kind of a weird case. He's maybe had a bit of the Ryan Bader syndrome going on, where we have seen him. He's been in the UFC for some time now. He's been in the UFC since 2010. So we've been watching Edson Barboza for almost exactly 10 years on the big stage. And that was only his...
5 years?
5 years, sorry. And that was only his 7th professional fight. So... we were watching a pretty undeveloped version of this guy from a striking background who was really barely getting used to striking for MMA and contending with all of these well-rounded opponents. And we saw him have a couple of those disappointing fights. The Jamie Varner fight, the Cerrone fight was almost a non-starter. And then the Michael Johnson fight, which was actually relatively close, all of it seemed to really kind of come together in these last two fights. I thought he did pretty well against Michael Johnson, actually. I really thought he looked good, and that Johnson was just too much pressure and also too durable. He just didn't care about being hit. Even better is the fact that Paul Felder didn't seem to care about getting hit either, and yet Edson Barboza seemed to fairly comfortably beat him. I thought the fight was consistently close, but I did think that Barboza deserved at least 2 rounds, if not all 3 of them.
Well, yeah, it was. I thought it was one of those competitive but clear fights.
Close but clear for Barboza.
Won at least 2 of 3, if not all 3.
Yeah,
I would need to look back at that, but yeah, no, that was a clear victory for him. The different pieces seem to be coming together in terms of range strikers, and Barboza is a defined outfighter. Like that is,
yeah.
He is. We have talked about this many times, but he is as clear an example of an outfighter as you will ever see. That he doesn't even want to, we talk about outfighters as all the way in or all the way out. He doesn't even want to be in. He doesn't even want to be in the clinch.
No.
Like that, there is one set of ranges at which he is comfortable working, and everything else in his game exists only to get him back to that range.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the reason that was kind of failing him for some time, the twofold, I guess. We've talked a lot about what we term as rote striking from Edson Barboza. Kind of overthinking what he's going to do or planning his attacks in advance and then letting them go regardless of what the actual opportunities were in front of him. So he'll feint something, he'll think, okay, now I'm going to feint and throw the uppercut, and then that's when he got dropped by Danny Castillo, for example. Trying to do that, setting something up and not really looking at what's in front of you, but just expecting the openings to be there, almost like you're fighting a pair of mitts, a pair of focus mitts rather than an opponent, or hitting a heavy bag. And he looks good doing it when it works, but it left some kind of openings. And then he would spend so much time thinking about the next thing, he'd leave himself open. The other problem was footwork. Barboza didn't seem to necessarily have all of the lateral movement and the pivoting necessary to keep that distance. We saw that in the Jamie Varner fight, for example, where Varner just ran him down. Barboza was just desperately trying to back away, couldn't get far enough away. And that's the problem. If you're going to back up in straight lines or end up skirting along the cage, you're going to get trapped eventually. You have to be able to hit tight pivots. And Barboza did that really well in that Felder fight, making nice, quick, tight turns, tight side steps, keeping himself in the center of the octagon or something like the center of the octagon without ever really being backed into the cage against a pretty solid pressure fighter. So I thought that performance really said a lot about how far he's come.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing that Barboza used to do was stop to watch his work a lot. Mm-hmm. So he would throw, and then he would just go back to standing in front of you, expecting you to respect what he's just done rather than to come back at him.
And that would have been a real problem against Felder.
Yeah, and so part of the way he's done a couple of things that have gotten him around this. You mentioned the lateral movement, Connor. The other one is becoming a really vicious counterpuncher. That when you try to pressure him, Barboza is perfectly happy to stand his ground and throw 3 or 4 punches that serve, like, he doesn't want to exchange with you, but if you're going to come at him, he's going to make you realize that you're going to have to walk through shots in order to get there.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, that is an essential tool to have if you're going to be an outfighter. You need to be able to disincentivize your opponents from coming at you. And finally, Barboza seems to have realized that and worked on it to an extent that he's comfortable doing it.
So who do you like in this fight, Pat?
I like Tony Ferguson, simply because that for all of the improvements that Barboza has made, he's still only really comfortable doing one thing. As good as he is at that thing, if you can keep it close to even with him there, you can beat him elsewhere. You can take him out of that particular set of ranges and win the fight. So Michael Johnson did that by just balls to the wall pressure.
Yeah.
Like that Johnson didn't want to spend a moment with him at range. He wanted to spend the entire fight in the pocket, in the clinch, trying to take him down. I think that Ferguson is more diverse, and he's going to be able to put in some work with him at range, but at the same time consistently pressure, be confusing, exploit the fact that Barboza is going to throw those counter punches at you, and work in the clinch as well. I think he's just got more options and more things that he's capable of doing here.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think Ferguson can probably do something similar to Johnson and make up for the gap in striking skill, which is probably smaller than most think, just by way of volume, just sheer volume and aggression and feinting and variety. You know, Ferguson's happy to throw elbows off of hand trapping and hand fighting. He's happy to, as we said, sit down on good straight punches. He will throw these awkward, long, stepping body kicks. He'll throw front kicks off of both legs. He'll be constantly switching stance and making small changes of angle, covering the distance in different ways. I just think it's probably going to be too much for Barboza to handle. But we have underestimated Barboza in the past.
Yeah, I think because, like, one of the things about Barboza, you can count on him throwing pretty much exactly the same volume, whether he's being pressured or not. Like, he just always tends to stick in at exactly the same pace. Like, he's going to throw 9 to 12 strikes a minute. Yeah. He's never really going to go above that, and he's not really going to drop much below that either. He's a very steady in many ways predictable kind of fighter.
That's a great point. And basically when opponents have respected, and it's hard not to respect him. He kicks very hard. He's got good pop in his hands. He's an authoritative striker. But when opponents just refuse to respect that, he tends to either struggle or lose. And I think that Ferguson's the right guy to just say, you know, forget it, I'm just going to walk through this and keep coming forward. And he doesn't even have to walk through that much because, as we said, very solid defensively.
Yeah, exactly. I think that if this fight turns into, if there are multiple layers of exchanges here, then you're going to know that Ferguson is winning the fight.
Sure.
And so yeah, I like Ferguson here. I don't think he's going to finish Barboza, but I like him to take 2 rounds for a 3-round decision.
Yeah, I agree with you. That sounds about right. Okay, we got 2 more fights to discuss. Let's try and cover them relatively quickly because we're already a little over time here. First of all, Johnny Eduardo versus Aljamain Sterling. Overall thoughts on this fight and both fighters?
Fascinating matchup. Aljamain Sterling is a great young fighter. There's a ton to like about him. Really, again, there's a reason that his nickname is the Funk Master. He too has a funky style of wrestling that blends really nicely with Matt Serra trained jiu-jitsu. He likes to throw a lot of kicks on the feet, a lot of interesting kicks that serve to cut off his opponent's space and force him towards the cage. He likes to pressure. He's a very intelligent fighter, a really, really smart guy. Who does his thinking outside the fight. He does his thinking in the gym. And that leads to him doing really creative and intelligent things in the cage as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. The major drawback for Sterling that I see is that he's a bomb squad fighter. He came from the same gym initially as John Jones, and his striking kind of looks like it still. You know, where it's a lot of disparate pieces. The kicks and things like that, I don't always get the sense that Sterling knows exactly what he's doing as a striker. Or that he's looking for things that are more complicated than what he should be looking for, if you know what I mean. Where he's thinking, okay, I can throw a spinning back kick to counter this lateral movement, when maybe like a left hook or just a good left round kick would do the job, and keep him in better position to make something happen with his wrestling. And I think that could be a problem against Johnny Eduardo. I favor Sterling in this fight, but Eduardo, I think, is probably one of the purer counterpunchers in MMA. He is an excellent counterpuncher, in fact, but not that great when he has to lead. The thing is that Sterling keeps a lot of pressure against most opponents, tends to fight fairly aggressively. And so I think there's going to be opportunities for Eduardo to land a big counter right hand, and we've seen him have competitive fights almost based entirely on that weapon against good fighters like Rafael Assunção. He knocked out Eddie Wineland with a good counter right hand. And he's got good defense too. He's done a lot of the training, I believe, at Nova União, the Muay Thai.
Yeah, he is. Eduardo is when they don't have somebody else coming in. Like a lot of the Nova União fighters work with Pedro Hizzo and a guy named Alex Chadoud, who is a really excellent Dutch-style kickboxing coach. They have a Cuban boxing coach that Aldo's working with for this fight. But on a day-to-day basis, the guy who's doing a lot of their striking training is Johnny Eduardo.
Yeah, and so he looks like kind of an archetypal Nova União striker, where he's got this kind of weird, stiff head movement that they have. Like Valmir Lazaro has this as well. Very upright, swaying head movement. But the best thing about it, and Aldo does too, actually, kind of a bizarre style of head movement. But the best thing about it is that he keeps himself over his feet when he moves his head, and he's ready to throw back. And he does throw back when somebody attacks him. Almost always when he manages to slip an attack, he's going to come back with a right hand or a left hook. Got good leg kicks. He can turn up the aggression when he needs to, but as I said, better as a counterpuncher. The grappling is obviously, I think, it favors Sterling. What do you think about Eduardo, and who do you favor here?
I favor Sterling, and I think that youth has a lot to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Eduardo is an older guy. He's been around for a really long time. Doesn't seem to have affected him much. He's very quick. He's still very athletic and a hitter, too. He's got some pop in his shots. Even at, what is he now, 36 or 37? I'm going to look this up. He is 37 years old. Despite that,
wow.
He's 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 like a 20-year MMA veteran. I think he had his first fight in like 1996.
Though pretty inactive, right? Like pretty sparing with his fight. He hasn't kept the crazy schedule, has he?
No, not at all. He has been sparing with it. But I favor Sterling. I just think that his creativity is a huge part of that. I see a little more intentionality with the things that Sterling does striking wise in the cage. With that said, if this is a striking match, absolutely, Eduardo is going to tear Sterling up, and it's not going to be all that, and it would not be all that competitive. But Sterling's unorthodox striking, I think, leads very clearly to his grappling in smart ways, in ways that work on his behalf. And I think that while it's going to be difficult, he can and will force Eduardo to the cage. The thing that I like about Sterling a lot, and this doesn't necessarily lead always to exciting fights, but he understands that, like, if he can win a fight through grinding it out against the cage, he's going to do that. Yeah. If that's the only way for him to win a fight, he's not going to think like, oh, I need to break off and throw strikes here. He's going to say, okay, I can win 2 minutes of this round doing nothing but beating him up against the cage. He's perfectly willing to do that. He's happy to do it. And in a fighter who's that inexperienced, he understands the importance of those things. And I like those little edges to come together. Eduardo has very good takedown defense, really, really good takedown defense. But Sterling is one of the more talented and skilled chain wrestlers you're ever going to find. He also, with his grappling style, does not need to get you all the way down to capitalize. He's got a great front headlock. He's got an incredible move to the back. If Eduardo gets himself out of position for even a minute, Sterling is going to be on it. So yeah. I like Sterling to find a way. I'll pick him by decision, but I think he can find a submission as well.
I agree. I think Sterling by submission is an okay pick. And I think it is just the variety of skills. And that seems to be the kind of tone of a lot of the picks we've made tonight. Just the fact that Sterling can do a lot more and is willing to do a lot more, even if, as you said, it means putting on a kind of a boring fight. He's smart and he's a competitor, so he will do what it takes to win. I didn't mean to imply that there's not intentionality. I think Sterling is smart in how he selects his strikes. I just think his toolkit is a little inefficient, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's like it's a whole bevy of power tools that require an extension cord and a charged battery when, a screwdriver will do now and then. Where, he's going to reach for something that'll get the job done, but it's a little overcomplicated or a little overwrought sometimes.
If his Instagram is to be believed, Ray Longo has him working extensively on throwing left hooks. So I don't think you're wrong about that. I think that his coaches probably realize that there is an extent to which you need to get him to pull those things out only when he needs them.
Yeah, let's do some good basic shit and make the spinning back kick an occasional surprise, something based on what you see rather than just like a go-to, things like that. So that's good. I think Ray Longo's great at doing that and also still keeping the unorthodoxy there. Chris Weidman's happy to throw weird stuff, but he's got a good meat and potatoes striking game. So I agree. I think Aljamain Sterling, I think a second or third round submission seems fairly likely. Just with such a venomous backtake game as he has, it's hard to imagine, even if Eduardo can stop the takedown, it's hard to imagine not ending up in something resembling a turtle or a three-quarters position at some point and having Aljamain climb to his back. So our final matchup, Paige Van Zandt, Rose Namajunas. That's headlining the Thursday night card. I don't know what they're calling it, but
it's the Fight Pass event that'll be going down to kick off this 3-day extravaganza of fights.
Yeah, one of the very few cards to be headlined by strawweight female fighters. Probably the very first to be headlined by a non-title fight in that division. Of course, Paige Van Zandt's the big old star. Rose Namajunas has that potential as well. How do you see this one playing out?
Well, I think this was a really unfortunate opponent change for Paige Van Zandt.
Who was her initial? Was it?
It was supposed to be Joanne Calderwood.
Yeah.
I think that there would have been people who picked Calderwood in that one, but I would not have been one of them. I would have picked Van Zandt handily to walk through Calderwood.
Yeah.
That is not the case here. I think that Rose Namajunas is, though she's the underdog, she's coming in at about plus 170 right now. I think that Namajunas is going to knock Paige Van Zandt's block off.
You think she's going to knock her out?
I don't think that she'll necessarily knock her out, but I think that she will knock her down and jump on a submission to finish her, yeah.
I think that seems, I think a submission seems fairly likely. If not a pretty comfortable. Actually, I don't know if I can see this one going all 5 rounds.
Yeah, I don't see that happening here.
It seems improbable. I agree with you. I think Paige Van Zandt would have really, really benefited from the opportunity to just use her aggression, because that's the best thing she has going for her. You know, there's a lot of backlash in the MMA community because she's been so heavily hyped because she's pretty and I guess she's charismatic.
She is not charismatic at all. She is pretty.
She's charismatic in the way that high school age girls are charismatic, which is to high school age boys. But
like, I sat across from her at a media day for an hour and a half. She does not have a charismatic bone in her body.
She kind of not to be rude, but she strikes me as the kind of person who could have a really long conversation about like stickers.
I don't know that she's going to be having a long conversation about anything.
Not even about stickers, Pat.
No, I don't mean to be harsh on her, but like especially because she's like 21 or whatever.
Well, sure.
But I as a 21-year-old was not like a scintillating human being. Like, let's be real about this. But like, seriously, if she's going to be built into something, it's going to be on the basis of media training and her good looks. And I don't think that's not an insult to her to say that. It's just like there aren't levels to this shit with her. It's not like there's something waiting to be discovered there.
Sure. My initial point was that the backlash is a little unfair because all this media attention, everything has invited everyone to pick apart her game. And of course there are a lot of flaws. She's a young, raw fighter. She's still very undeveloped. She's hittable. She has all these flaws, but she's very aggressive and very confident. And that makes her really dangerous. And I think against Calderwood, that would have been a boon. I think she could have really put the pressure on early. And though Calderwood fights back pretty well, as she did against Courtney Casey also had some terrible, terrible decisions made in that fight. And I don't think Paige Van Zandt makes that many terrible decisions. You know, she's pretty straightforward. I'm really glad that you brought that up, Connor, because I think it's important to get a feel for what Paige Van Zandt actually does here. She's a pressure fighter. That's what she I'd almost call her a swarmer.
Yeah, I think that, but either way, her whole game is predicated around aggressive forward movement to pin you against the cage.
Yeah.
That's what she does, and she's not bad at it. She's athletic. She's pretty quick on her feet, and she's very, very durable.
And not afraid to get hit either. She's happy to walk through something if it means walking you backwards.
Exactly. And against the opponents that she's faced thus far, that has been good for her. That's been enough. And against Joanne Calderwood, who is a tough opponent but not a hard hitter, I think that would have been enough as well.
Yep.
Like that she would have been easily able to walk through those shots to get her into the clinch. Eventually work some takedowns and get her top game going. Rose Namajunas can match because for Calderwood, for all of her skill in the clinch and on the feet, is not an athlete. She's not fast. She doesn't hit hard. She's not terribly strong. Rose Namajunas is a next generation kind of athlete. She is ridiculously fast on her feet, great hand speed, really slick movement. Looks like she's put together well. to an extent that kind of fooled people when she was on The Ultimate Fighter, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think she seemed to have polished up a lot of the flaws that Carla Esparza took advantage of in the Angela Hill fight. She seemed to be a little more back to basics with her footwork and her boxing game. And you don't want to ever stifle the creativity of a fighter like that who has the athleticism to be completely creative and just pick any wild move out of the air and go for it. But you want to have it on a solid foundation. And I think that Namajunas is starting to build that. And I think that's kind of a bad recipe for Paige Van Zandt.
Yeah, because the one of Van Zandt's big advantages is her pace. So she, if we break her game down into component parts, it's athleticism, aggressiveness, and pace. That's what wins her fights.
Yeah.
Namajunas can match her for aggressiveness, she can match her for athleticism, and she can exceed her pace. And we talked before about how about the fact that Van Zandt is willing to walk through shots to get to her preferred spots. Well, that's not good against somebody who can throw 15, 20, 25 strikes a minute the way that Rose Namajunas can.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't help you. That doesn't get you to your spot. It's not gonna wear her down in the same way.
And I get the sense that Namajunas is more of a natural finisher. Van Zandt is like an attritive finisher where the referee doesn't want to watch you get hit anymore. Namajunas makes people stop fighting. She really is more of a potent fighter. I've used the word venomous a lot, but it really seems to apply to her. So
she has like Carlos Condit style killer instinct.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the comparison that I used for her when I was first evaluating her game, and it's one that I stick to. Is I think she's a more athletic relative to her competition version of Carlos Condit. That she relies very heavily on pace. She's not necessarily a killer one-punch hitter, but she throws a lot of volume, and she can sense when you're hurt.
Yes. Yeah, and like Condit, I can see her going into a future of hurting people on the feet and then jumping on submissions, like a Condit or a Cerrone. I think that'll probably be her bread and butter because she's a better submission grappler than she is a striker. But the striking's coming along.
Yeah. She's also well coached. This didn't necessarily come through when she fought Carla Esparza when Pat Barry very famously kept yelling for a head kick at spots where you didn't need a head kick. But she has been trained by Trevor Whitman. She's got good coaches. She's surrounded by good training partners. And right now, especially with regard to the striking, this is something we'll get to next week when we talk about Chad Mendes versus Frankie Edgar. That is not really something that you can say at this point.
Yeah, what's a great way to prepare for Paige Van Zandt? Just have her spar with Justin Gaethje.
Oh my God.
No problem, right? Should be fine.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's if you could stop Gaethje from going crazy and knocking her block off.
Which you couldn't because Gaethje has said he only goes nuts in sparring. So he spars hard again all the time. So, not actually a serious suggestion. Please, no one ever make that happen. But both of us picking Rose Namajunas. Should be a good fight regardless. Just good fights all over this damn weekend. And there's so many more that we won't have the chance to discuss. But that does it for today's episode. We're over time. Hopefully you guys don't mind because there's just so much good stuff to talk about today. And next week, we're going to be talking about, of course, Jose Aldo versus Conor McGregor, but also Frankie Edgar versus Chad Mendes, which headlines the Ultimate Fighter finale happening the night before UFC 194, and Max Holloway versus Jeremy Stevens, which has Max Holloway in it, so you know why we're talking about it. And that about wraps it up. Pat, do you have anything people should look out for this historic 2 weeks away from 194 week?
Oh boy, do I.
Yeah.
So this week is going to be fairly light for me. I'm writing an op-ed on how December is kind of a make or break month for a lot of the UFC's young talent. Like this 3-day stretch of fights is designed to highlight their young up-and-comers, so we'll see if their investments have paid off.
It's a gauntlet.
But then next week, and it would have been even more true had Mirsad Bektic not injured himself and had to pull out of his fight with Tatsuya Kawajiri, which is a huge freaking bummer.
That fight's not happening?
Yeah, no, Bektic, I think, tore his ACL.
God, what a horrible time to find out.
Yeah, dude, I think a lot of people didn't even know that fight was happening, which meant that the first they were hearing about it was with the announcement of the injury.
I just found out about it a few days ago, and now I find out it's not happening.
That's the tone of your voice there is really sad, man. I'm sorry that I did this.
No, that's such a good fight. I'm so pissed. And an ACL injury, that is horrible, man.
Especially for a guy who relies so heavily on his explosiveness and physicality the way that Bektic does.
One of the best prospects in the sport. That sucks. That's a bummer.
Yeah, probably already on skills, a top 10, if not a top 7 kind of fighter in the featherweight division. So But yeah, so I've got that coming, but the next week is going to be huge. I've got a lot of stuff coming. I will have an in-depth, probably 2,000 to 2,500 word breakdown of Jose Aldo versus Conor McGregor. I will have a combined preview of the 2 fight night cards with just the main card fights, or with in-depth looks at the main card fights, and then kind of quick picks for the prelims. And then I will have my full usual preview for UFC 194.
Nice. Well, I think I'm going to be having a technique recap of sorts for the Tyson Fury upset coming out on Flow Boxing this week, as well as, I think, a movie review of the movie Creed, which I saw recently from kind of a boxing perspective. It was good. Have you seen that?
No, I would really like to. I've heard amazing things about it. Everybody that I know that's seen it has loved it.
It wasn't perfect. I think it's got such good reviews. I expect it to be incredible. It was a good movie, though. It was very solid. So I'll maybe be doing that for Flow Boxing as well. Coming out with the video preview of UFC 194, and then next week, and I guess I'll talk about this again then, but I may try and do one of these this week, is I'm going to try and strategize for both of the underdogs, both of the challengers in the title fights of 194. So I'm going to try and come up with a succinct game plan for Rockhold, which will be very difficult for the reasons we discussed earlier, and then a succinct game plan for McGregor against Aldo as well. I always like to come up with ways that challengers can beat dominant champions. So that should be fun. Man.
That should be a very, very great deal of fun.
Thank you, Pat. I'm looking forward to writing it. Hopefully all of you guys look forward to reading it, blah, blah, blah. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. So much more to talk about next week, so make sure you tune in. We will be your one-stop shop for what makes them drop. I just came up with that catchphrase, or have I used that before?
That was awesome. That was fantastic.
I may have said that before. It just came to me, so I'm having a Paul McCartney moment, like I heard that melody somewhere else before. I'm trailing off here. Thank you guys for listening to today's episode. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.